The Committee of the Whole is now back in session. There was a request for OFB to be present, and so we now have Mr. Hernandez, who's here, Vice Speaker. You recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are we going to go through this now? Did we decide which pages are up for discussion?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the questions, Vice Speaker?
You said you were going to get the amendment in writing, and I was asking for clarification of which pages in the fiscal realignment plan were going to be included.
Okay, I know that they're preparing it, but I understand it's the whole document, the whole bill? It is the whole. Senator San Nicolas, can you just make that clarification one more time, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's the governor's fiscal realignment plan, the figures within that plan less the figures of the original amendment.
Senator, can you go page by page, please? Right here. He's going to give you one. Sarge, you can give it to Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, amounts are referenced on page 2, section 2, all of page 3, all of page 4, all of page 5, all of page 6, all the way to page 115. All the way to page 115 because miscellaneous appropriations also includes amounts. And just to clarify for the record, Mr. Chairman, this fiscal realignment plan is is an amended version of the budget that we passed, and so whatever we do not change in this fiscal realignment plan remains as public law in the original budget that we passed. And so if we don't change the miscellaneous provisions, those remain intact as originally passed with the Budget Act. And so this includes only the amounts on page 2 to page 115.
Thank you, Senator. Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are we going to go section by section, or how do you want to proceed? Just the whole bill? We just ask all the questions we want? Or?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, then I guess I just wanted to confirm with OFB that the revenue projections as set forth, it's clear that the governor has adjusted the income taxes and by 67 million as OFB projected, a $67 million reduction. Do you have any issue with the way he has taken it out of the different income tax categories?
The changes that were made in the FRP, well, just first off, the OFB just did a summary of the fiscal realignment plan. So the plan itself was not submitted by OFB. The changes to the revenues, all I can speak to is just what we see in the fiscal realignment plan, which is a reduction in individual withholding and corporate taxes in the amount of the 67 million that was estimated by OFB in terms of the impact of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. As to the basis of, or the reasoning behind reducing those amounts, if there are any differences between what was in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act impact analysis that OFB did, I can't speak to that, but all we'd see is that it was adjusted downward by approximately $67.05 million. And then with that, there's the adjustment of the 2% reserve. It was adjusted down from 14.05 million to 12.71 million. That's as a result of the reduction in the income taxes. So
If we are going to use that 2% reserve, can we use that 2% reserve? And would we still reflect it here, or would we delete this or increase?
the 2% reserve is a requirement. It's called a 2% reserve, but it's actually a 98% appropriations cap. So unless that is done, notwithstanding that specific provision, I think it's 22425 of Title V. Yeah. Unless that's notwithstanding that requirement, then that could be, I guess, reduced by that 12 million that's left over in the fiscal realignment plan.
Yes.
For the 2% reserve could be used for, I guess, open for additional appropriation.
If we were going to do that, where would we make the amendment? I mean, is it on this revenues page or just appropriated, are you saying?
I would assume that a new section would need to be added to the existing bill as Bill 248 to, I guess, repeal it, or there in a section could say that notwithstanding the specific section requiring a 98% general fund appropriations cap, that could be done.
All right, and then DOE has discussed with us that it looks like the cuts that they are being made to them are approximately over 19 million. And if we want to put money to DOE, or readjust the cuts so that DOE cuts are limited to around or less than 19 million. I mean, do you have any recommendations as to additional sources of where we would make those changes, as opposed to what's obvious in front of us is to go into all the other appropriations and reduce those and bring the money over? Is that what we would have to do? And I know that the governor's only cut general fund appropriations, or in this fiscal realignment plan, not any of the special fund appropriations, and that's why some agencies look like they're cut a lot, some look like they're cut very little because they were funded primarily by special funds. I mean, yeah, I guess we can go in and do that one by one to cut the different individual appropriations and move the money. And I guess that's what we're going to have to do, Mr. Chair, and we should put these in writing. But I guess I'm asking OFB if there's any other suggested method of doing that.
I'll just confirm that your statement about the fiscal realignment plan, based on what was submitted, our analysis showed that only general fund appropriations were reduced. And I'll just restate it, because when we had initially released this report the day after the fiscal realignment plan was submitted, that we noted that the fiscal realignment plan reduced general fund revenues by 65.71 million. That's net of the 2% reserve reduction. But it only reduced appropriations by 47.82 million, leaving a budgetary shortfall of 17.89 million. So I just wanted to reiterate that, that based on our review of the fiscal realignment plan that was submitted, that there's still a shortfall of 17.89 million.
All right. Have you looked at the cuts, for example, to the Guam Police Department or the other agencies, and would this realignment require them to make cuts to their personnel? To filled positions, rather?
Yeah, according to the fiscal realignment plan for the Guam Police Department, the reduction in the appropriation level was 2.59 million. I can't speak to the justification behind the 8.64% reduction because OFB didn't prepare the fiscal realignment plan, so I am not. I can't speak to the reasoning behind it or the justification of the impact to that agency.
Point of information,
You mean the
Mr.
details?
Point of information, Mr.
State your
Chairman.
point of information, Senator.
I appreciate what the Director of OFB just stated, but in our previous discussions with the administration's financial team, the reason why they were cut that way or from their fiscal realignment plan was because the cuts were made per rata in terms of how much of the budget each agency took. In other words, say for example, this is just hypothetically, that the budget for Department of Public Safety was, let's take a number, 15% of the overall budget, then 15% was taken, the budget for public safety was reduced by 15%, and that was the basis for how they got to this point. Thank you.
Yeah, and I do want to state that with the fiscal realignment plan, we did note that the general idea of the cuts were across the board pro rata share, but I would note that as an example, the medicinal marijuana lab was cut 100%. The Commission on Decolonization, which is fully funded by the general fund, was cut 32%. The BBMR employee CWA appeal back pay was cut 6.29%. So in general, there was a pro rata reduction. As another example, animal shelter was cut 15%. So in general, there was a pro rata cut, but then there are some agencies, that's why I can't really speak to the reasoning behind it. I could say in general, maybe there was a pro rata cut, but there are some individual agencies or individual programs that were cut more than 8.66%. So,
Vice Speaker, you
Are
have-
we able to get, instead of, doing this so painstakingly, are we able to get some kind of, I don't know, just a summary of which of these cuts, our budgets were based on estimates of payroll or, personnel in these agencies, things like this. And so by cutting, which of these cuts impact personnel, particularly in the public health and safety areas. That's what we're very concerned with. And of course, the DOE. I'm hoping we're going to make amendments with the DOE, but, and I want to propose amendments, but can you just, I guess it's to make it very clear for everyone that the reason we're amending these things is not because we don't want them, we don't want cuts across the government, but we're trying to make the cuts where they won't affect public health and safety personnel. And I know that when BBMR first, sent out their circulars, they were estimating that, well, they calculated everyone based on their voluntary, what they agreed they were going to do, that totaled 37 million. And so the difference between, and so we could see in their responses to BBMR some of the details of where they were going to cut. The gap for me is when they came in with a $47 million cut versus the 37 million, now we don't know where that 10 million, what it's going to impact. Does it impact personnel, I guess? And which agencies does it impact personnel versus, the other agencies where it's only impacting, for example, the medicinal marijuana lab and not personnel? Are you able to tell us which of the, additional cuts in this FRP compared to the BBMR 37 million cuts affect personnel? Is that possible?
what I can do is I'll just explain at least my understanding of kind of the evolution of this FRP or at least the initial cut that was proposed by BBMR in their circular number, I think 1804. And it was originally a $47 million reduction in general fund with the assumption that there was an across the board 8.6% reduction to those agencies. I believe a subsequent hearing to that to the submission of that, there was a discussion of a $37 million cut. There was 15.7 million that was specific to executive branch line agencies, and then an additional, I believe, 22 was related to the DOE, EOG, GCC, the judiciary, the legislature, and some other semi-autonomous agencies. So that's my understanding of the 37 million. All we had received was, at least in that hearing, was the one-page attachment that showed the breakdown of 15.7 from line agencies and then the additional 22 from the other semi-autonomous agencies. In regards to details behind the 15.7, at least in terms of what OFB has in terms of documentation, was just that attachment. There was submission of all the agency submissions to BBMR that was provided to the SES. But in terms of trying to kind of get the details of that 15.7 million and seeing how and where items were cut from each agency, we don't have the exact details of that, and obviously I can't speak for the BBMR in that regard. To your question about if the FRP recommended cuts would cut into personnel, I don't have that information on hand. We would obviously have to do an analysis of the projected payroll, and at this point we don't have a good handle on if what was suggested in the FRP would cut into payroll.
Are there any cuts to special fund appropriations that you have already analyzed that we could make? I mean, I'm thinking we could go through those one by one also, but if you've got a summary of those that you might want to suggest or propose that we could make, that would offset and transfer that money instead to the general fund agencies that are being cut to, is that possible?
We don't have any final information or data relative to any special fund cuts that at least I have that's holistic enough to present at this moment. But with the FRP, it like as I mentioned and just confirmed to you that the FRP simply looks at the general fund and does not include any special fund related cuts or reductions.
At this point, Mr. Chair, unless we're going to go section by section, if to put in amendments, I guess I would need to prepare those a little bit, at least me. So if I could reserve some time to come back after I have those ready.
Point
Thank
of
you,
order,
Mr.
Mr. Chairman? This is
Yes,
a point of order.
yes.
To be able to make an amendment, right, is not proper at this time because we have not yet adopted the amendment to the amendment that actually includes it in the bill.
That's correct.
Thank you.
So if it's okay with the body, perhaps we could, we can do the amendment to the amendment with the understanding that if it does pass, that we can go back and do the amendments section by section, because we don't even know if this amendment to the amendment would even pass. Okay, so in the interest of time, if that's okay with the body, I'll now call for, there's an objection to the amendment, and so I'll now call for that vote. And just to be clear, the amendment to the amendment,
Oh, it's just,
there he is, written.
thank you. Before we go on the vote, Mr. Chairman,
Okay.
if I miss me, see the language.
Okay. Can we get copies made, please?
Yeah.
The other senators would like a copy of the amendment. So
Thank
we'll
you.
take a 1-minute recess. Okay, the committee of the whole is back on. So this is what we're going to do. There isn't an objection to the amendment. What we're going to do first is take the vote on the objection, and with the understanding that if the amendment does pass, the amendment to the amendment, then on Senator Lee's amendment, that's when we can go item by item, section by section on the fiscal realignment plan, because now it's part of Senator Lee's amendment. Okay, Senator San Nicolas, you're fine with that as well. That's your understanding as well. Okay, Senator Espadon, we're okay? So there was an objection to the amendment to the amendment. Okay, so we'll now call for the vote. All those in favor of the amendment to include the fiscal alignment plan to Senator Lee's amendment, please signify by raising your hand. So. Motion fails. Senator San Nicolas, you're on your amendment. I mean, you still have the floor on Senator Lee's amendment. If not, we're still on Senator Lee's amendment. Any discussion on the amendment? Okay. 30-second recess. Committee of the whole is back on. Senator Lee, did you have or there's anyone on Senator Lee's amendment? If not, Senator Ogden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. On the proposed amendment, I know that the good senator, if she can just expound on the numbers, explain how she came about with the numbers, because I noticed that the numbers are slightly different from what is in the governor's fiscal realignment plan. Mr. Chairman, if she could yield.
Senator, would you yield?
Yes, I do, and I thank my colleague for that question. This amendment was drafted with a 10% reduction in fiscal year 2018 general fund appropriation to the Guam legislature, to the Office of Finance and Budget, and the Office of the Governor. And the prior speaker is correct in that the fiscal realignment plan that was sent down to this body from Adelup only indicated a 2.94% decrease for the Office of the Governor, as I'm reading it. It indicated an 8.66% decrease for the legislature, as well as an 8.66% decrease for the Office of Finance and Budget. So these numbers do indicate a larger reduction in 10% across the board for those 3 entities. And I just wanted to reiterate that I really believe, and I know that many of the members of this body believe, that we have to lead. We have to be the first ones and to really show and demonstrate what we mean when we say that it starts with us. We need to be the first ones to volunteer to take these cuts. I think that it will be difficult for us to continue to do our work. But I, for one, would be glad to take a cut and to figure out ways to make it work within our body. When presented with the alternative of closing fire stations, of closing the Hagåtña precinct, Mr. Chair, those things to me just are non-negotiable. And we shouldn't have to worry about nurses at GMH or teachers in our schools and have them have the burden or have them have the worry of potential payless paydays and all of these other things that are looming with this fiscal crisis. So I really believe that we can figure out how to make it work on our end, especially when we're asking, and this bill is proposing to increase taxes on our people, increase taxes on people across our island that are already struggling to make ends meet and have already sent us messages and phone calls about taking out multiple jobs and multiple loans just to make ends meet, just to put food on their family's table and keep that roof over their heads. So we have to demonstrate to our working families that we're willing to make those sacrifices too. Sejos Masi.
Thank you very much, Senator. Okay, well, she's closed on her amendment already. That was a
She did?
close. Okay, she closed on her amendment, yes.
No, I
Oh,
thought,
you-
because her
Oh,
amendment...
no, sorry, you had a question, so she
Yes,
answered your
yes.
question.
She answered
So
my
go ahead
question, but
and
I still
you
have
still
the
have
floor,
the
Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think it's, and this is my own personal observation, but I think it's extremely unfortunate that our only cost reduction that we have in this measure is being proposed by the good senator. We're talking about $800,000 from the governor's office, approximately $50,000 from OFB, and approximately $800,000 from this body. So $1.7 million, Mr. Chairman, is all this proposal proposes to decrease. And all this time, our people have been clamoring and saying, if you want some of my hard-earned money, then you also have to reduce costs. We had a proposal that identified approximately $47 million in budgetary reductions, real reductions, for the balance of this fiscal year against the appropriation that was provided. But it is nowhere to be found. And I say nowhere to be found because the proposal has not been introduced. As we had an opportunity to be able to incorporate it in here, asking the people of Guam to pay 2% sales tax to generate whatever the numbers are. If it's $60 million for the balance of the fiscal year, $120 million for next fiscal year, that's $60 million out of the pocketbooks of our consumers, our own people. And $120 million the next fiscal year out of the pockets of our own people. But we give them a measly $1.7 million budgetary reduction. I have a serious concern when it comes to that, Mr. Chairman. Because are we here to seriously buckle down and look at the numbers and say, okay, the governor did his part. He gave us a fiscal realignment plan that proposed to reduce $47 million from the budget. That could have been the starting point in terms of cost reductions for the balance of this fiscal year. Then there's a proposal, the heart of this proposal, Bill 248, which is to raise taxes on our consumers, on our people. 2%. There's the reorganization proposal, and I thank all of our colleagues for allowing that to be incorporated in this measure. But Mr. Chairman, if this in fact is going to conclude our conversation based on amendments, we gave the people of Guam $1.7 million in budgetary reductions. There's nothing that forces the administration to comply with the fiscal realignment plan, Mr. Chairman. Absolutely nothing. The 2%, if that passes, guess what? And sufficient revenues come in, they don't have to cut anywhere. It's status quo. This entire government is going to be status quo. The reorganization plan will probably not even be effectuated because possible explanations are we don't need to. We have enough revenues coming into the government to be able to sustain us. To me, if there's any additional revenues coming into this government, it should go to education, public safety, and health care. Nowhere else. That's why I'm extremely, extremely disappointed, Mr. Chairman. And I commend the sponsor of this amendment, but $1.7 million of budgetary reductions. And if this measure is concluded today and voted on, and we're going to send the governor a proposal to reduce the fiscal year budget for the balance of the fiscal year by $1.7 million, and incidentally, people of Guam, we're going to ask you to pay for the operations of this government status quo an additional $60 million. We're not doing our job, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator. Please also don't forget the proposal a few nights ago to reduce the legislative budget even further by allowing only $100,000 for us to operate on. So we just want to make sure that's on record as well. Senator San Augustine.
Mr. Chairman, I would just like to ask the author of the amendment, why wasn't the courts included? The other branch, there's 3 branches of government. They weren't included. That could be an additional $800,000. Just curious.
Senator, would you yield to the question?
Yes, and I thank the preceding speaker. If he would like to make an amendment to the amendment, that's his prerogative. Oh, yes.
Yes, I would like to add them on. I just don't know the exact amount. And maybe I can get legal. No, an amendment to your amendment. I would have no problem with that one, because that's about 800,000.
Senator, we can come back to you. You want to prepare that, and then we'll. Senator Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to applaud the mover of the amendment to include the legislature in the cuts. I think this, at its face value, puts our money where our mouth is. The difference, though, with all due respect to the prior speaker, the difference is we're cutting. Everybody who serves in this body who should be here is here. And I think we can make that determination for ourselves. So I do support this amendment to cut my respective budget. The difference is you don't have the Department of Education to answer to the $20 million stipulated in the FRP, which was predicated on the absence of any other source of revenue. That's the difference. I am committed to further cutting the executive branch. I made that commitment to my colleagues, but not without them here to answer to phase 2 and phase 3 of their austerity plan. And I'm talking about the Department of Education. So that's the difference. And I do rise in support of Senator Bisco-Lee's proposed amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Castro. Is there anyone else on the Lee amendment? Senator San Augustine, are you ready with you have an amendment? Okay. So we'll take a 1-minute recess. Committee of the Whole is back on. Senator San Augustine?
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw because it was identified that the courts are giving up $3.5 million. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On the Lee amendment, if not, Senator Lee, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, I just want to thank my colleagues in advance for their support of this measure. I think we need to lead by example. And I'd also just like to state for the record that this 10% reduction of all three of these entities was actually pulled from a bill that was already publicly heard. So that's Bill 244, which was Speaker Cruz's measure. And so I'd like to, again, just thank my colleagues in advance for their support. And I hope that this can be the first amendment of others that we consider that could potentially look at ways of reducing the government of Guam, making our government more efficient, and making it work better for the people. Sijus Masi.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Are there any objections to the Lee amendment? If none, motion carries.
Thank you.
Senator San Augustine, you're recognized with your amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have, they're passing out the amendment right now. The amendment is to section the 26701 on page 2 on the levy. The amendment is to strike after property, strike everything else. The and any service including but not limited to, and so forth, all the way until they get to the end of related services, and leaving at the rate of 2%. Page 2 of the bill, of Bill 248. As two of my colleagues have expressed, they wanted to see a reduction in the government by only leaving the retail portion on the sales tax, which will only generate $52 million a year, and there's only 6 months left, it'll generate $26 million, then the government will have no choice but to reduce, which is what a few of our colleagues here has asked, that they be forced to reduce because there's only going to be so much that would generate. And we need to keep in mind that as our colleagues here talk about the 47 million, we can cry all we want about DOE. I'm the oversight chair of DOE. There's 19 million that the 47 million included. Okay? There's a total of, when you look at the fiscal realignment, it's a total of 24 million. I also oversee UOG and GC. And UOG and GC has been absorbing every time they don't get their allotments. So we can talk about how much we want to save, but one thing I don't want us to be faced with next week, when there is a pay this, some of you may not believe there's not a true fiscal crisis, but I believe that by amending the sales tax just for the purpose of retail, I'm passing out now the spreadsheet that was also presented during the hearing, except it only is going to identify maintaining the 4% the BBT and adding the 2% on the retail. It generates $52,457,000 a year. 6 months left, only generates 26. It also identifies within the bill the 75% for GMH and 25% for DOE, and the government operation only gets 13 million. So it's coming around right now. So that the issue of the government has to reduce, this only provides them a little bit. So it will end up forcing them. But this body needs to understand we would have to sit here and entertain that reduction, not just leave it up to the governor, because we're the appropriation committee.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Uggan on the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I know the mover of the amendment is proposing to delete a certain portion of subsection 26701, but there was a previous amendment that automatically will exclude any purchases for liquid fuel and gas at our service outlets. So, Mr. Chairman, because that amendment passed, that amendment really should be part of this particular provision prior to acting on this amendment.
Thank you, Senator. That's
Thank you,
correct.
Mr. Chairman.
And so if we can allow legal counsel to ensure that that is part of this, this section.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as long as everyone understands that that's part of the provision, that section. Thank
That's
you, Mr.
correct.
Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Espadon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're just applying a sales tax to tangible personal property, and I would imagine those are the goods sold at stores and whatnot. If I recall correctly, at the public hearing on the sales tax, part of the presentation spoke to the food stamps or the SNAP program. That in itself, I believe the SNAP program, the 2017 was $103 million, and the sales tax would generate an extra $2 million. However, the argument was made, and I'm not sure if it was an argument or if it was actually spoken to, that the SNAP, the goods that are bought with SNAP benefits, the food stamps, right, whether they should be exempt from the sales tax or not.
They're exempt
They are exempt.
by federal statute. You cannot apply the sales tax on the food stamp.
Right, but I'm not sure that it's clear in this bill, you know, and then now we're just talking about tangible personal property, that there is an exemption in accordance with federal law. And so I'm not sure if that figure that was presented to us on this spreadsheet actually already eliminates the amount of purchases for SNAP, right, to come to the amount that would be generated by a sales tax. And so I guess that is the question, the first question to the mover of this amendment, of whether the benefits of the SNAP program are included in the figures on the spreadsheet to come up with the figure of $25 million of benefits to the government.
No, it's not.
Okay, so
We just minus the 2 million, it's 24 there.
so if we minus the 2 million, right, it'll probably be about $23 million, $23.7 million. And I just want to make sure. However, again, I'm asking my colleagues to make a mental note that I believe that within this whole bill that's before us, that there probably should be a provision that exempts the SNAP benefits, just to make sure everybody is clear of what the local law is. Even though it might be federal law, not all establishments understand that those benefits are exempt from sales tax.
As a matter of fact, Senator Esteves has an amendment that was going to identify that. That's why I didn't want to bring that one up yet until he identifies it. There is an amendment to list them as exempted.
Mr. Chairman, point of information, I believe that should be circulated to add a new subsection to read, and this language is consistent with other states that have a sales tax with regards to the exemption on eligible foods as defined in 7 CFR 271-2 pursuant to the Food Stamp Act of 1977, which does very explicitly state that items bought using SNAP or food stamps are exempt from the sales tax. Mr. Chairman, I have not yet proposed, or, but I'd like to reserve actually that time because there are other exemptions I think are critical to the bill, and I'd like to address them all in succession in a single subject under that the subsection. So If my colleague would yield, I definitely think it will be addressed if he'd give that courtesy.
Thank you for that point of information. Again, I just wanted to make sure we were all aware that there were exemptions in the total amount that would definitely reduce the total amount of expected revenues from this sales tax if we limit it just to, especially since we're limited just now to tangible personal property. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator on the San Augustine amendment?
Mr. Chairman, if I may. Just. Mr. Chairman, I'm looking at the language, and there are some things that I believe may be problematic with this specific language, and that's with regards to, we do apply it to tangible personal property, and that is defined, but what we run into the issue, as we had discovered when addressing 249, is kind of the broad range and definitions of the time it's going to take to really promulgate what we're constituting as tangible personal property, and for businesses to ensure that they're taxing it. What I do propose, Mr. Chairman, is an amendment to the amendment, with the understanding that there will be a follow-on amendment to apply the definition. And this is taken from 249. And the way the amendment to the amendment that I'm going to be proposing, and I will get it written down for my colleagues to see, but that it shall read, to amend section 26701 to read, there is hereby levied a sales tax on tangible personal property at a rate of 2%. Retailers shall add the tax imposed on retail sales and sales at retail or the average equivalent thereof to the sale price or charge, showing such tax as a separate and distinct item, and when added, such tax shall constitute part of such price or charge and shall be a debt from the consumer or user to the retailer until paid. Now, I know it's a bit wordy. Understand that in the research provided in 249, which in 249, understand as introduced and was publicly heard, was specific towards retail sales and towards the retailers. So these definitions put, and the way it reads, it applies the tax and explains where that tax is applied to. So in the application and implementation of the sales tax, it's very, very explicit where the tax applies to and who it applies to, Mr. Chairman. But again, this is to be followed up with the definition of retailer, which is essential to target that. Just to add a little bit more, to make implementation simple, defining retailer is just pulling the definition and citing the definition as is in BPT. So the definition of a retailer who pays taxes associated with their retail license would then therefore liable to collect and hold in trust the sales tax of retail sales.
Senator Espadon, is that your point of order?
Point of order. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify, was that an amendment to the amendment? And is that amendment to the amendment written out? Because it seemed pretty verbose. And without reading it, again, it'd be hard to basically dissect and make sure that it's that there are no unintended consequences without knowing what the real wording is. So if the mover of the amendment to the amendment could provide the written form again on that, because this is going to be in law, it would be nice to understand what we're actually going to be voting on.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Espadon. Senator, can you get
Yes.
it done in 2 minutes?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay,
As I did preface with my comments, as I move the amendment, I am going to distribute it to my colleagues, but for the sake of time and consistency, as we're addressing this amendment, I thought it was important to propose the amendment, and then now we will take the recess for me to develop it so that they could read it in front of them. But I didn't think it would be appropriate to say I have an amendment, everything stops without kind of prefacing where it was going and how it relates to the current amendment. So I will take the time and I'll get that, Mr.
Okay,
Chairman.
we'll take a 2-minute recess.
Test, test.
Committee of the Whole is now back on. Senator Esteves, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my colleagues should have in front of them the amendment, and it's to amend Section 26701, which shall read, "There is hereby levied and shall be assessed and collected a general sales tax on tangible personal property at a rate of 2%. Retailers shall add the tax imposed on retail sales and sales at retail or the average equivalent thereof to the sale price or charge, showing such tax as a separate and distinct item, and when added, such tax shall constitute part of such price or charge and shall be a debt from the consumer or user to the retailer until paid."
Thank you very much, Senator Esteves. On Esteves amendment, Senator Ogden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I certainly hope the legal counsel and the clerks are tracking the previous amendment that was made with regards to the exemption provided to liquid fuel gas at our gas stations, because apparently this is like the third amendment that has come across our desk, and it is not inclusive in that particular in these particular amendments. And I just want to ensure that provision that was already adopted by this body is inclusive. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. We'll make sure that we have legal and the clerks have that noted. Senator San Nicolas on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm trying to just stay with this language here and work myself through it. I guess I'd like to pose a question to the mover of the amendment to the amendment. Was this language gleaned from some other source, like was it from a sales tax statute in another jurisdiction?
Correct.
Senator, do you yield?
Yes, Senator, I yield. Correct. I can go back to my notes. It was either, I believe, Maine or Colorado. Now, when I did and continued, and my staff continued our research, the reason why it's all-inclusive and promotes certain things such as average equivalent thereof, sale price or charge, is because historically there would be businesses trying to avoid the imposition of the sales tax on the customers by altering the name of it. And we've kind of seen this before in some other things with regards to tipping fee, service charge. So what this does is, one, it does a couple of things. It applies the tax on retailers, which is the intent of the original amendment. It dictates or demands that the tax be shown as a separate and distinct item on the receipt, which is typical with sales taxes, and that the sales tax will constitute part of the price and charge. Now, again, and then also the last thing, Mr. Chairman, is that when we apply this as a debt from the consumer to the retailer, it's consistent with what a sales tax is, which is a charge on consumption and charge on the item. When you impose the levy of taxes, especially a sales tax as opposed to a BPT is a tax on the business, which means they're just liable for that. But when you place a tax on an item, you have to implicate who initially is liable for the debt. Then afterwards, you initiate who's liable to remit. So there's kind of, and I have follow-on amendments to address that. But with regards to the levy, yes, to answer your question, yes, this is language consistent with other states' sales taxes.
Thank you, Senator. Does that answer your question, Senator San Nicolas?
It does. I appreciate the answer that it is either from Maine or Colorado. I just want to read into the record again, Mr. Chairman, just what the amendment to the amendment says, because, well, let me just read it. Retailers shall add the tax imposed on retail sales and sales at retail, or the average equivalent thereof, to the sale price or charge, showing such tax as a separate and distinct item, and when added, such tax shall constitute part of such price or charge and shall be a debt from the consumer or user to the retailer until paid. I don't, is Mr. Camacho here? I'm just not sure that this is all very necessary. It sounds very convoluted. I mean, like, what is a tax imposed on retail sales and sales at retail, or the average equivalent thereof? I guess I'd like to pose that as a question. Can the mover of the amendment to the amendment give me an example of what is a retail sale and sale at retail's average equivalent thereof?
I can answer that. I'll yield to the question, Mr. Chairman. What I was going to propose in a follow-up amendment are the definitions that follow this, which I think is essential to doing that. But considering it was an amendment to the amendment, I didn't think it was correct to place definitions if it was not. There should have been passed around definitions that will follow up in a subsequent amendment. Now, the reason, again, where it says equivalent thereof is because industry standards, retail sales, sales at retail, are common industry standards. I have no problem if we want to strike or the average equivalent thereof, but that's kind of a catch-all language because as a colleague of mine said, words matter. And businesses have a lot of flexibility in what they want to call things. Again, whether it's a surcharge, it's a gift, it's a sale, it's a purchase, it's a transaction. But what that line there does, an average equivalent thereof, allows the leeway for the tax commissioner to basically call a spade if said business is trying to commit any type of fraudulent activity with regards to the sales. But if we're asking what a retail sales and sales at retail, the follow-up proposed amendment is going to apply that definition to this statute, and it's a definition, again, pulled based on research looking at other states, and that was publicly heard in Bill 249. Retail sale or sale at retail means the sale of in any quantity of quantities of any tangible personal property or service, including any such sales effected via the internet, taxable under the terms of this chapter. These terms shall mean all sales of tangible personal property to any person for any purpose other than those in which the purpose of the purchaser is to resell the property so transferred in the form in which the same is or is to be received by him, or to use or incorporate the property so transferred as material or part of other tangible personal property to be produced for sale by manufacturing, assembling, processing, or refining. And I understand it's a very long, convoluted definition, but you find similar language in many of the state sales tax, and I believed it, and it seemed to be tried and true. Now, when you really break down the language and definition, it does cover a wide range of things. For example, this in part covers wholesale, because our research led us to believe some businesses under multiple names use tactics in which they sell each other things between the different corporations and subsidiaries and make claims on their taxes in order to either avoid or claim or basically try to escape the sales tax. So I think although the language may seem very, very convoluted and long, I think it closes a lot of these loopholes that I can understand, Mr. Chairman. I know it's a very long answer, and I apologize to the good senator from Dedito asking the question, but I do have an intention to put these together.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, I don't understand this amendment to the amendment. I don't understand the necessity of it. I mean, even the way it is written, retailers shall add the tax imposed on retail sales and sales at retail or the average equivalent thereof, and then when the mover of the amendment to the amendment went to go and define retail sale or sale at retail, he basically defines them as the same thing. You know, I think it's important that when we're going to be instituting a very new policy into the community, it needs to be as clear as possible, as easy to follow as possible. And then if we see that there are certain areas that need to be tightened, I think that's when we should come back and at the policy level tighten it. But I mean, I'm a finance guy and I'm having a very difficult time trying to understand why this is even necessary and how this would even work, even with the explanation and even looking at what the proposed subsequent amendments will be. So I prefer we keep it simple. I'll talk about the amendment in and of itself later after we've disposed of this amendment to the amendment, but I don't think that this helps in the implementation of something so new. I think it makes it much more complicated, and I think it could just lead to, I mean, not only enforcement problems, but implementation problems if for some reason the nuances in the language are just adhered to differently by all the various parties that are going to have to follow this mandate. So I would object to the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. There's an objection to the amendment to the amendment. And just to, if it gives anyone any comfort, that another amendment that we'll be entertaining from Senator Ada requires the rules and regs to be put in place, and perhaps some of the questions you have, Senator, is something that could be answered in that amendment if it does pass. So there is an objection. Anyone else on the amendment to the amendment before he closes? If not, Senator, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to understand, so as I'm understanding, the amendment to the amendment has been objected to because just don't understand it. And I get it, and I can respect that language should be simple, but let's not forget that we are policymakers and that we could try to simplify language all day, but what really matters is the language effective in what we're trying to do, because the devil is in the details. And I'd like to give you an example of such, because on the bottom of that of that amendment to the amendment, and shall be a debt from the consumer or user to the retailer and paid. Nowhere in 248 we've levied the tax, but there's never been a liability placed on any party, Mr. Chairman. And that matters. That matters if you're trying to do tax enforcement. Who's responsible for it? If the business doesn't collect it, but the consumer is responsible for it, who's liable for it under the law? That's why policy is important, and identifying that in the law, albeit it may sound like too wordy, a little bit too complicated for the language, but Mr. Chairman, the weeks, months spent working on this, learning and understanding what a sales tax is, I fully encourage my colleagues to move forward, understanding that, yes, tax law is a bit complicated. Yes, it's going to take some time to understand. That's where we need to work together to try to simplify it. But we don't do that in statute, Mr. Chairman. Statute should be effective. I was waiting for the picture to be finished.
Senator, go ahead.
Statute should be effective and deliberate, not easy. This is the legislature, Mr. Chairman. This isn't preschool.
Thank you very much, Senator. So on the objection to the amendment, all those in favor of the Esteves amendment to Senator Sanagi's amendment signify by raising your hands. Motion fails. You still have the floor, Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we don't need this. I'd like to propose, if my colleagues should have a copy, it should read collections. It's to add a new section to read.
Mr. Chairman,
yes.
just a point of order, please.
Oh, yes.
Yes, we are on the San Augustine amendment, so we gotta,
My apologies, nothing further on the amendment.
okay,
Mr.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
On the San Augustine amendment, any other discussions? Any objections to the San Augustine? Senator Espadon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a question, and again, we're going through this quite quickly, and I was going to reserve this comment for general statements about this bill, but, you know, we're creating a whole new tax. We're moving quite quickly through this. None of us here are tax experts, nor do we have an experienced tax expert in here to guide us, or at least to give us any kind of suggestions of what we should be thinking about. In this amendment, it limits the sales tax to tangible personal property. And again, in general, you can say, well, anything bought at a store or even when you dine out at a restaurant, that probably applies. Now, when you come to other business entities, let's take, for example, a car repair shop, and they have a service, but that service also encompasses parts that need to be put on. So does this apply to that sale, that a tax should be placed upon the part that's going to be added on to the car as part of their service? And I guess that's it's a question. It's a very general question, but it's a consideration that maybe the move of the amendment could answer. I mean, it seems to be yes. But so they would then need to itemize the cost. Say, for example, you go for an alternator repair, and the mechanic goes in and has to put some pieces in it, then he has to break it down. Normally the charge is straightforward. It's going to cost you $150. Now we're saying that now this service needs to itemize and differentiate between the service and the part that he's adding on. I guess that's the question.
Senator, would you yield?
Yes. Number one, and I understand where you come from, because like when I go to the air conditioning repair, they charge me one price, parts and service included. It just talks about what they're going to do.
Right.
With the parts. So I would be charged the sales tax on that, like you just mentioned. But on some repair shops, they'll tell you, if you buy, this is for the part, this is the labor, that's the service part. You'll pay a sales tax on the part. You'll find this normally at dealers. They will charge you for parts and separate for labor. But normally on all other shops, they would capture it all as one. Because then that's when they kind of like trying to give you a deal. They'll actually tell you, says, I'm going to reduce this, but this is going to be one package. Because that's just how they do it.
I understand. So now the question becomes to rev and tax. How do you enforce it? In other words, if they don't report that there was a sale of the part, it was a service altogether, and now we're only talking about tangible property, which would be the part itself, and it's not included in anywhere, how would rev and tax be able to know that a tax should have been placed on that part?
That's when we provide the rules and regulations. And I know, for example, your example in an auto shop, I know they obtain a service license, but the products or let's say, for example, the alternator or the radiator that they install, that is personal property that is subject to the sales tax. So that should be part of the sales tax when imposed, if this lower to pass. It also basically deals with other services. If you, for example, you come in and they manufacture something, a product for you, the service that you're basically providing is not subject to the sales tax, but the product, the personal property, should be subject to the sales tax.
Yes, and I appreciate that answer, but it doesn't really cover the whole full spectrum of the concern. Because let's go back to the example of the car repair. I know there are a lot of car repair shops who actually, to get the part, go down to Napa and buy the part. And so I would imagine they're going to be taxed down there. When they buy retail, of course they buy it at a discount because they usually have a discount. But then does that mean that so that's almost a double taxation. So once they buy it and it's taxed, and then you have to include a tax on top of the service, of the part that's going to be included in the service, there's going to be another tax? Because now he's selling the part as well, and he might be adding a little bit of a margin on that, probably not much more, but something. And so does that sales tax apply there?
That's why, when you look at the structure of the taxation, if a distributor or a wholesaler sells it to another business as a wholesale, then basically it shouldn't apply. The sales tax shouldn't apply. In other words, because you're not selling it to a consumer, you're selling it to another retailer. So actually, when it's sold to the consumer, that's when the sales tax would apply. Unless you basically want to also tax the wholesalers or the businesses.
Well, again, if it wasn't a wholesale price, like I said, there are some smaller shops who will actually go down to Napa, buy the parts that they need, and it's not necessarily at wholesale price. It's at retail price, and of course, because they're part of a discount card that they get, just because they're a freaking customer, it's still a retail. And then they're going to turn around and install it into the vehicle, and do they have to then put a tax on that as well?
One more time.
Bottom line, some of these smaller shops, they don't buy it at wholesale. They'll call somebody, they'll call Napa, they'll call Chief Auto Parts. How much you selling it for? Okay, I'll take it. I'll take that car part. And they'll be charged, maybe they'll get a little discount, but they'll still be charged the tax because it's a tangible good. And so when they take it back to their shop and install it, that's the service they provide. But now they might have a markup, and we don't know, right, on that part that they just bought. And so they would have to calculate the tax on that part again?
Basically, if you're talking about BPT or we're talking about sales tax?
Well, sales tax. I guess that's the conundrum.
That's why I'm saying that for sales tax, it's really, it would apply when you actually sell it to the consumer. So if you're selling it from a wholesaler from one business to the other business, and you have a wholesale license, and for the purpose of resale, then basically what we're saying is that it shouldn't apply on the tax. But when you actually charge the customer now, it's a different tax. First, they pay the GRT on the whole amount, and then when you actually sell it to the person, there's another layer of tax, which is the sales tax, which there's no exemption.
But that would be hard to track, don't you think? In other words, if they don't charge a sales tax on top of it and include the increase in margin or into their price of service, then you'll never be able to identify. Because in essence, the argument can be made that the user really is the mechanic shop because they're using it in the performance of their service. And so I'm a little bit unclear how this is all going to come out. And thank you, Mr. Camacho. I know that you're trying to make that answer, but it hasn't clarified anything for me just yet. And so there are reservations about this as it stands. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Point of information, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, state your point of information.
Typically, that example was actually quite accurate. In that event, if a business purchases from a licensed retailer, they end up being the consumer, and they are responsible and liable for their sales tax. If it's for the performance of a service-based business, then it is their discretion on whether they're going to pass that tax on to a customer in terms of towards their expenses. But that's how typically taxes on consumption and taxes on goods are done. It's done on the item, typically with the end user. Although my amendment failed, Mr. Chairman, I have another one because it's still important that you identify that the tax is supposed to be collected by the retailers. As I stated before, tangible personal property is way too broad. And so you have to hone that into retailers and then apply that definition, the definition of a retailer, in order for this to actually work. Or else it's going to be difficult, near impossible to regulate.
Okay, thank you for that information.
Mr. Chair,
You
if
still
I
have the
may,
floor.
just a point
Yes.
of order then, that maybe we're doing this backwards. Maybe we should include the definitions in first and then try to go forward from there. Because absent any definitions, then again, we'll always come back to that same spot. You know, it's like, well, where does supply and what does that mean, and who's a retailer, who's not, and so forth. And again, we just might be putting the cart before the horse and trying to figure out how to move.
Thank you, Senator. On the San Augustine amendment, Senator Ada and then Senator San Nicolas.
Mr. Chairman, the Director of Revenue Tax has indicated clearly that, you know, there's going to need to be rules and regulations promulgated, and that's probably where we would go to find the details, right? And so, given that, I would like to make an amendment to the San Augustine amendment such that we unstrike the words on the second line there, the words any service business. And in the rules and regs that will get promulgated, then I think that's where Revenue Tax will have to, you know, further define what the service businesses are that the sales tax will be applicable to. But I don't think we want to limit that in the law itself. And so, otherwise, if we just say tangible personal property, then it's really, you know, just that thing that you can hold in your hand. So I would just like to make that amendments to unstrike those 4 words, and any service business.
Thank you, Senator Ada. On the Ada amendment, Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see the intent of the mover of the amendment to the amendment. However, I don't think that statutorily Revenue Tax will have the authority to narrow the definition of service business. I think that if we leave it open in the law, Revenue Tax would need to assess it on every service business. So if we're going to create exemptions, we're going to have to spell that out now, because if we just remove the strike through on and any service business, then it basically will still apply the sales tax to all service businesses, including those that may want to be considered for exemption.
So is that an objection, Senator?
As proffered, I would need to object to the amendment to the amendment.
Okay, thank you. There's an objection to Senator Ada's amendment to the amendment. Anyone else wish to speak? If not, we'll take a vote on it. All those in favor of the Ada amendment to the amendment, signify by raising your hands. Motion carries. Senator Ada, you still have the floor.
That's all I have for the San Augustine amendment.
Thank you very much. Senator San Nicolas, you have the floor now for the San Augustine amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to, well, now that we've put service businesses back on, I think that that changes what my initial conversation was going to be, but now I need to change the nature of that and speak to perhaps some changes we need to make to ensure that we're not going to be levying a sales tax on certain industries to which that tax may be more price sensitive or difficult to implement. And so I'd like to proffer an amendment to the amendment. And after the word business, in service business, that's been reinstated, I'd like to add the word excluding. And I would like to remove the strike-throughs and reinstate the words banking and lending services, foreign currency services, and insurance services. Add the word "and" in between services and insurance. I'd like to thank the clerks for their diligence in following our proceedings very closely. It's been quite a day. So my amendment to the amendment will have it read, there is hereby levied and shall be assessed and collected a general sales tax on tangible personal property and any service business, excluding banking and lending services, foreign currency services, and insurance services at a rate of 2%.
On the San Nicolas amendment to the amendment, are there any objections? There's an objection. All those in favor of the San Nicolas amendment to the amendment signify by raising your hands, please. Motion carries. Senator San Nicolas, are you?
I'm fine for now, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. On the San Augustine amendment, are there any other discussion? If not, are there any objections? Yes, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, I'm really having a hard time going down, making all these amendments as quickly as we're making them. I mean, I'm trying to use best judgment within a matter of seconds without even being able to understand the ramifications and its application to a whole bevy of businesses and circumstances. And I just need to state that for the record because I'm going to come back again and say it again several more times. And this is all without any guidance from anybody who has experience in taxation or who has, or in laws that actually helped implement any kind of new tax. I know that in other jurisdictions, any new taxes that were created and maybe even changes to the tax law require months on end of discussion and analysis and understanding the economic impact and the impact on the various businesses. This one, again, we made some changes. I voted for the amendments, but I just want to be very honest with everybody. I voted for it in good faith, hoping that it'll produce something good. But in the end, I'm not certain that we just created some unintended consequences that we're not even aware of because we haven't even discussed it. So every time we go into an amendment, and if there's nobody raising their hand to speak to it, it may not mean that they don't object. It might just mean that we just haven't had the time to fully comprehend the effect of these amendments on the overall bill and what it would do to the entire community. And I'm concerned that we are creating a law, a new tax law, with so many unintended consequences that it could end up being in court or unimplementable. when really the issue at hand before us here that it's been before us for the past 6 weeks is a fiscal crisis that says we're going to have a $67 million shortfall in this fiscal year alone, which will then jump up to $100-some million next fiscal year, which starts in October of this year. We have no running tally of the cause of the effects of all these causes that we're creating. And so in the end, even just by speaking to the, limiting it to tangible property at first, and now we're throwing back in any service business, not knowing full well what the definitions of those two clauses encompass, we're voting blindly. And I have a real concern with that. Because in the end, it might be this whole bill with all these amendments that we're making might be so convoluted and us not knowing what the real ramifications are, and that the sum of the parts is going to be greater than the whole, that I'm not sure it could garner any votes. Or if it garners votes, we're voting blindly again, not knowing the full consequences of what we're doing. And I know I'm supposed to be speaking to this amendment, but this amendment is part of that whole thing, because we keep adding, and we have a lot more amendments coming. And in the end, I'm not sure what we're going to have. I just need to state that for the record. We're creating a whole new tax of 2% a sales tax, not knowing who it really affects, what businesses it affects, and whether the rules and regulations can be put in place in time to actually see any kind of revenue come into this government that needs to be in soon. Otherwise, we do face the paydays. Otherwise, we do see the closing of services and perhaps even facilities. And then we act like we know what we're doing when it comes to taxes. And I'll tell you right now, even with my legal education, I don't know what this is when it comes to the tax policy that we're creating. I think we need to stop and really think about what we're doing here. Because if we just keep on going and try pretending, or at least making the attempt, I won't say pretending, but making the attempt to create a tax policy that we don't know where it's going to go and what it's going to affect and what it's even going to raise. All we know is what it might raise based upon some figure in one public hearing. I'm not sure that's enough to really create a whole new tax. And so I say that because now I'm hesitating of whether I should even be here anymore. Only in that, at this point, I'm not sure I can support anything anymore, at least on this specific bill. And I'm not sure how others feel, but I think we all have to be very cautious. Because in the very beginning, nobody wanted to go down the road of increasing the BPT because it would have a negative effect upon those who can afford it, who can least afford it. But that's exactly what we're doing here. We're creating a new tax that will still be applicable to the people who could least afford it. And of course, the counter argument would be, well, at least they can make a choice of whether they're going to buy it or not. If you need it, you're going to buy it, but it's going to come at a higher cost than it would be. So I'm not sure I'm sold on that whole tenet. I just wanted to state that, Mr. Chair, and caution us as we keep going down this road of adding amendments after amendments. And I know we're trying to really get a clarity in the law, of this bill to create the policy law, but in the end, do we really know what we're doing? I'm not sure we do. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. On the San Augustine amendment, any other discussion? Senator Nelson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just, after hearing what one of our colleagues expressed his concerns, I mean, perhaps we should give the DRT director an opportunity for a response to this.
I guess this is when we put the rules and regulations together. I know sales tax, varies in different states. Some states, have sales tax on even lease and rental of properties. So they're all different, they have different, but at least the statute already speaks for itself. You're limiting it to retail. And that's the biggest part is the retail part and service. So when we get into this part of, coming up with the rules and regulations, we concentrate on those two areas, retail and service. Everybody on this island would need a business license for retail to sell at retail and service to provide service. But again, the definition on personal property, is something that we'll look into and see how it should apply on the service side. And from there, I think we can look at the statute, and we can adopt the rules and regulations, and we can make it work. This is something that I proposed earlier on adopting the general provisions of the BPT, because it deals with all the administrative rules and regulations. It deals with basically how penalty works, when the taxes are due, and what happens if a taxpayer disagrees, and all these things. It's all in there. It's the rules. I think almost every title here adopts the provision for administrative provision, for the BPT. It gives them the guidance how they operate, how should they operate. I think those are the things that we will look at, and if we're only looking at service and retail, I think we're basically, even the BPT defines what services businesses are. It's in there. What the meaning of service, and also sales. It's in there. If this body wants to define what, I see a proposed amendment here that basically we want to define what purchase mean and retail. We can put that as part of the general sales tax provision, in addition to the other provisions that are afforded in the BPT. So, looking at this, looking at the retail and service, I think if that goes through, and I see these two definitions right here that can be part of it, and you adopt the administrative provisions of the BPT for the administrative part, I think we can go from there and try to come up with rules and regulations. This administrative provisions for the BPT allows the director of the Department of Revenue to provide rules and regulations approved by the governor. In other words, if you read the statute. So we can make those, regulations and procedures. So, there's a lot of guidance from other areas, other jurisdictions that, we can look at. And I guess if you go into all the stages, they have different programs. Some of them even tax lease of equipments as sales tax, lease of cars for sales tax. It all depends. But we have this service that is defined on the administrative procedures for BPT. Everybody has to get a license in order to operate a business on Guam. Whether it's retail or service, we can go from there. And if the definition is provided for this particular Article 7 general sales tax, so it'll help out. You gave us the guidelines. I see there's a definition of what purchase is and what is the definition of retail sales. That will give us guidance moving forward. And then we can basically, the concept is there. Generally, sales tax normally applies on the consumers. So, it's almost the same concept of a BPT. BPT, if you are a wholesaler selling it to a retailer, then there's no tax. Same concept, on if somebody were to bring in equipment, and there was actually for resale or parts for resale, they don't pay it because it's for resale. In other words, the concept is there. All I'm saying is that if you pass this legislation, and then we can work on the rules and regulation, we'll try and get it. There's a lot of guidance from all the different jurisdictions. We only have two things to look at: retail and service. I mean, this is what I'm seeing right now. So if we can look at that. I'll work with my staff. We'll come up with the rules and regulations as quickly as possible. If we have to go to the AAA process, we have to go to the AAA process. Get it approved, send it to the legislature, and you have it there, to adopt the rules and regulations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Camacho, for that very good explanation. Thank you. On the San Agustin amendment, anyone else have any discussions? Are there any objections to the San Agustin amendment? If not, motion carries. Senator San Agustin, you still have the floor. Okay, Senator Tamara, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman. I think Bill 248, when it started, provides a general framework for the assessment or the use of the sales tax. So in 26701, it talks about that a sales tax is to be levied at the rate of 2%. In 26703, it talks about who's going to be responsible for administering it. And in Section 2, it talks about the use and the appropriation of the revenues that are to be generated. And I believe that this general framework is sufficient from the standpoint of establishing the policy. And I've passed around an amendment to amend Section 26704 regarding the rules and regs. And basically, if we were to pass Bill 248 tonight, we would be basically saying we authorize the assessment of a general sales tax at the rate of 2%. However, the tax or the implementation of the tax shall not take effect unless and until the Department of Revenue and Taxation submits to the legislature the rules and regulations implementing this article within 180 days in accordance with the administrative adjudication law. So basically what the amendment that I'm proffering is that rev and tax can go away here tonight if we pass this legislation, and the department will have up to 180 days to submit their rules and regs. If they can submit it next week, I would hope that the oversight chair would grab it, introduce legislation to adopt the rules and regs, conduct a public hearing, and then we'll discuss it on the floor to amend that. And then from that point forward, the sales tax can be fully implemented. But I share the same concern that was expressed earlier, is that I really feel like we're flying in the dark, and we can make and tweak this thing all night long, and not certain as to whether we're voting the correct way or not. But I think we should leave it to Rev and Tax from this point to develop the details of how this tax is to be implemented, and then we should move on. Now, I should point out that passing or authorizing the assessment of a sales tax, I'm not as confident that we're going to be able to begin generating those the revenues that are needed with a great degree of certainty. that we would if, for example, we were to increase the BPT. So that's still another issue that needs to be resolved, but at least with the authorization of the sales tax, we would have a piece in place that would eventually down the road hopefully be developed and allowed to begin transitioning out of the BPT. So the amendment that I offer then is to basically, in addition to authorizing the levy of the sales tax, is to require rules and regs to be submitted within 180 days, and then the legislature will review that and adopt it. Thank you.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
State your point of order, Senator.
I don't mean to be rude, but several hours ago, I had an amendment that I was proffering, and we just had to have it photocopied to be passed around. And as chair, you requested to have other senators move other amendments, and you never came back to me for my amendment that I wanted to proffer.
Okay.
And so, and now we're moving into a new amendment that I know for a fact was not drafted prior to my own, and I'm just trying to make sure that we're going to be able to give everybody equal opportunity to be able to put their amendments forward. And so I will yield to the retiring speaker, but I just wanted to raise a point of order that I do still have an amendment that has been several hours.
Okay,
that
well,
we're
I don't have it in front of me. If you can get it in front of me, then we'll make sure we'll recognize you right after Senator Ada. Okay, thank you. Senator?
That's it.
On the Ada amendment, Senator Castro?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with the prior speaker's sentiments and concerns about the need to promulgate and to be as precise as possible, but I want to ask the director, with the amendment that's been put on the table, Mr. Camacho, what is the soonest you think DRT can develop the rules and regulations and implement it in accordance with the AAA process as articulated here? That's my first part of the question. My second part is, if we do not implement the provisions that you're going to write out, the rules and regulations, in accordance with the AAA process, what happens next? So if we don't, as an example, if we don't implement in 30 days, what does that translate to in terms of furloughs, 32-hour work weeks, layoffs, shutdown of services, etc.?
First thing, I would basically see what we can do to expedite the rules and regulations. But there's probably rules that we have to follow also in the AAA process. I got to go back and check those rules. But we can definitely come up with the rules and regulations in a very, very, ample time. Maybe a week. Maybe within a week we can probably get the proposed rules and regulations, even lesser. We start working it by tomorrow. But I just don't know the timelines that how it's going to work out moving forward, what the requirements are of the AAA process. I need to go back and check. But as far as for our concern, we can actually come up with the proposed rules and regulations. I know we have to conduct a hearing for that before we actually send it over to the legislature for their approval, or for your approval, for the legislator's approval.
Thank you, and I'm not in any way suggesting we bypass the AAA process. I think Senator Ada's proposed amendment is a good one, but I just want to be very clear for the record. So let's say you do produce it in 5 days, and we hear it, we publish this in accordance with the AAA, you're looking at 15 to 21 days. What happens if we don't realize an infusion of capital into the coffer in 21 days?
I guess the question is, I know there's this morning I heard that we're there's a 5 million shortage of cash for the month for the month of March. I know we continue to see that shortage of cash moving forward. I know for a fact that, the impact on the withholding tax, from my understanding, even on the government side, the DOR side is around 18 to 20% lesser than what the government used to collect before the rates changed, and all the others that are being affected by the private companies and all these things. So these things add up every day, every week, every month, and I believe that I know the goal is to try to implement this something as early as possible, effective maybe April 1st, to realize any revenues, to come in by at least by May 20 or the month of May. But yes, there's going to be significant, severe changes that's going to happen if we don't basically start collecting that additional revenue.
Thank you, Senator. Senator San Augustine?
My colleagues, I understand. Mr. Camacho, if you can get the rules, and exactly what Senator Castro brought up, don't want to skip the AAA. I honestly believe the urgency is here. And if my colleagues don't believe it, we'll wait. Let's wait 2 weeks. And when the economy starts dropping, when revenue and tax does not receive any revenue because nobody in the government, which is 11,000 employees, do not want to go shopping because they don't know if they're going to get a check or not, then you'll know what the real impact is going to be. And I'm not making no threats. It's just reality check. I've talked to several people in both DOE and other agencies, and the only thing they're thinking about is that I'm putting money away. I'm not buying what I would normally go out. Look at the impact at restaurants. Look at just go out in the market and take a look at it. Because DOE has already advised me tomorrow, they're thinking of already advising the employees that they may start the furlough if there's no possible infusion. And I know my colleagues, we want to introduce a bunch of bills, want to increase fees, want to do whatever we need to do. We want the government to cut down, reduce, understood. But with no infusion of money, of funds at all in the government, it's going to strike us. And the OFB is using the record of what is already estimated in taxes that's going to come in. That's real numbers. And if you don't believe it, you've received all the documents. So I'm just concerned that if Mr. Camacho has the documents ready, the rules presented to me, I'm the oversight chair of Revenue and Tax, I will request for a hearing. We'll do the public hearing. Let's get this on the table and then we'll move on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Castro, did you have something to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With that said, I'd like to make an amendment to the amendment. If we could strike on the fourth line there, after Speaker of Legislatura, rules and regulations implementing this article, subject to the approval of the Guam legislature. Within 180 days, let me repeat that. So we're going to strike in accordance with the administrative adjudication law and replace that with subject to the approval of the Guam legislature. So in theory, DRT could turn around the rules and regulations, and we can hear that through whatever process is necessary, but have it ultimately subject to our approval, and then we can debate the particulars based on what they come up with. That would be my attempt to compromise on both Senator Ada and Senator San Agustine's concerns.
Okay, on the Castro amendment to the amendment, and Senator, perhaps if you want to make it even more clear, is it subject to approval by adoption of, is it a bill? Is it a resolution? Perhaps you can make that clear.
I'm not sure, Mr. Chairman, I'll defer to your tenure, but I think as long as we can come together as a body to approve the rules and regulations, I think that's ultimately, I think the concern is we just don't want it to leave it in the hands of the administration to
Point of
develop
information, Mr. Chair, what is the amendment? If we can make the amendment more clear, and perhaps if we have to see it in writing and instead of this banter.
Okay, I'd like to request for
Okay,
short
we'll take
recess.
a short recess.
Thank you.
The Committee of the Whole is now back in session. Senator Castro, you had an amendment?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. It should have been circulated. I apologize in advance for the my handwriting there, but we lost the electronic version. But if you can read that, we're striking in accordance with the administrative adjudication law, and it continues to read, which shall be subject to approval by the Guam legislature, handwritten in by statute.
Okay, on the Castro amendment, this is the amendment to the amendment, right?
It would be.
That's right. Senator Uggan, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I guess the only question I have is understanding that the rules and regulations are going to be promulgated, prepared, and then forwarded to the legislature, and the legislature would have to act on that. My question is, because the proposal is going to be formulated by the executive branch, in this case, Reverend Tax, I would think that they would want to ensure that they have a public hearing, which is part of the adjudication requirement. So now, if we remove, in accordance with the administrative adjudication law, I understand the good senator is trying to restrict the timelines or to compress the timelines, but because this will be formulated by the executive branch, I think it's only appropriate that a public hearing be conducted in case there's any recommendations for amendments or changes, or if there's any questions with regards to how it will be implemented by representatives from the business community or the general public, and then present it to this body. And then we can take it from there. So that's my only concern, Mr. Chairman, is the public hearing requirement really should be conducted by the entity that is formulating the rules and regulations. So I don't know how that would be incorporated in here, but I wanted to share that concern because that's a critical part of the entire process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Was that an amendment, or did you open it up for the mover? Okay. Senator?
Yeah, thank you. So when I was conferring with some other members of the body, the consensus was that if it comes in the form of a bill, naturally there'd have to be a public hearing. And so I'm not sure if that directly answers the senator's concern, but the assumption is actually if it's to be introduced in a form of a bill to be adopted, that it would require a public hearing. And the assumption then would be, if it's urgent, that the governor may call us into special session should we choose not to convene on our own.
Just a point of information, if in fact you're removing the administrative adjudication law, which is the law that requires that anytime you adjudicate rules and regulations, you go through a specific process. The formulation of the rules and regulations, the proposed rules and regulations, the conduct of the public hearing, the finalization of that particular proposal, it goes to the governor has to sign off on it, and then it's transmitted to the legislature. That is a part of the process. So now with the senator's amendment, he is proposing to delete in accordance with the administrative adjudication law. So that could conceivably allow Reverend Tax to formulate whatever proposal they have, bring it down to this legislative body without a public hearing. And because they will be the entity formulating the rules and regs, it's only proper that they have a public hearing and allow the community to express concerns or provide additional input in terms of how to improve the proposed rules and regs. So just in light of just a point of information, because the good senator alluded to the public hearing is still going to be part of the process. No. If you take away the AAA process, the administrative adjudication law, then it could conceivably allow Reverend Tax to formulate the rules and regs, send it straight down to this legislative body, even without the concurrence of the governor and the endorsement of the governor, because the AAA process requires the endorsement of the governor. So I just wanted to provide that clarification. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And perhaps just to also help the mover of the amendment, if the bill does come here, I think the practice that this body has been, what we've been doing is that even though that we're being called in a special session, the practice of this body is that we must have a public hearing. And so that's where I suppose the mover of the amendment is comforted to know that there will be a public hearing when it does come to this body.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I did discuss this with Senator San Agustin, whose oversight is taxation. My only concern is a difference in time. we're hearing and we're seeing the realities of every day that goes by. And so this is a difference of 10 to 30 days. I think we're still going to have that I'm sure we're going to still have that public hearing. But thank you again for clarifying, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. On the Castro amendment to the amendment? Senator Espadon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, it was mentioned that it would be coming out that the rules and regulations will be worked on by Rev and Tax, and then it will be provided to this body in a bill form? Is that how this works?
No, Mr.
Senator
Chairman,
Snoxen, yes.
my understanding from my discussion with Senator Castro is what it is that if need be, and Revenue and Tax has completed the rules and regulations, and because you need a public hearing, if I get it in a week, I'll introduce the bill if need be, or like what Senator Uggan brought up is that they could do their hearing in whatever number of days it takes them to put it together. Then when it comes to us, we can actually put it on the floor already because the hearing was already conducted. There's two ways to do this. Come to me, introduce it as a bill, or they'll introduce the rules, which is how the amendment is written, within 180 days, which shall be subject to approval by the Guam legislature. They can complete the hearing themselves, or they can bring it to me and I can introduce it as a bill.
Okay, so my understanding now from the explanation is that the rules and regulations could either take one or two procedural forms. One would be going through the AAA process, even though we strike out that provision in accordance with the administrative adjudication law. Or the other procedural path is that it will be sent down to the legislature and the public hearing process will happen here at the legislature. Is that the intention? Is that how this all works?
Yes, sir. That's at least my intent as a mover.
The question then becomes, since in law the rules need to go through the AAA process, is it required that a notwithstanding clause be injected in here somewhere?
I appreciate the advice. So if that would be appropriate, I guess we can insert the appropriate language. Thank you. Thank you, Senator, for the guidance.
Okay. Senator San Nicolas and then Senator Esteves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was under the operative impression that the whole point of us doing these rules and regulations was so that we could have as much community involvement as possible so that they can fully understand what Rev and Tax is going to be requiring in order for there to be proper compliance with the rules and regulations and the statute. Now I'm being made to understand that the intent is to get these rules and regs drafted and passed as quickly as possible. And so it kind of, I'm trying to really understand, are we doing these rules and regs so that we can make sure that we have a smooth implementation, or are we doing it so that we can have something else to pass quickly?
Do you yield to the question?
I
Senator?
do. Actually, I'm doing what's necessary, Mr. Chairman, to stave off a government meltdown. The Department of Education has communicated time and time again, phase 1, 2, and 3, Mr. Chairman. I'm hoping, in good faith, to work across party lines to pass a measure, in good faith, that will forego any further threats of a 32-hour work week, furloughs, or unnecessary consolidation of services without due public process. This is something that we've been discussing for 3 weeks. It's technically something that both sides have acknowledged should have been addressed as early as November. And so whatever the means is necessary to work together at a solution, based on the advice of the administration, we can't go another 30 days without a revenue enhancement strategy. And that's my point. My point is to try and arrive at a place we could take those threats off the table, Mr. Chairman, and I'm just going to ask that if the good senator is not going to support it, then that's okay. that's okay. But at least I'm putting my best foot forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very much aware of the circumstances that have been communicated very loud and clear to our public and to this body. I'm not trying to in any way take away from that. I'm trying to understand what's the intent of this amendment. If we were to amend it as being proffered by the retiring speaker, the mover of the amendment, to my knowledge, is seeking to create rules and regulations so that everybody can understand how this whole process is supposed to work. I think it's also supposed to ameliorate some of the concerns from some of our colleagues about how quickly this is moving and how concerning it is that we're going to be discussing tax policy at a breakneck pace. But that notwithstanding, of course, there are very clearly communicated concerns about the ability of the government to continue operating. I'm not quite sure how this amendment to the amendment is going to complement the original intent of the amendment, which is to have a very well-vetted process for rules and regulations to be established so everybody can understand how to move forward with this, and then at the same time try and fast-track it. The administrative adjudication law that's being stricken here, it involves public hearings and it involves the rules and regs, of course, being drafted and transmitted to this body. After it's transmitted to this body can, in fact, move on it to adopt it rather than waiting the requisite number of days for it to lapse and become effective. We can definitely do that. But to try and just strike through the administrative adjudication process and then just make it be a statute that we're going to adopt, I'm not sure if the intent is going to be to just have the rules and regs drafted, called into special session to adopt it without a public hearing. Are we then going to refer it back to committee for public hearing? I mean, I think we should just stick with the process that's established and keep the administrative adjudication law as the operative language, and then from there, pass whatever rules and regulations are put to the body. If we want to expedite it, of course, instead of waiting for it to lapse into law, we can just introduce it and pass it. So I'm just trying to understand the need for the amendment to the amendment as proffered. But yeah, that's all I wanted to raise, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Is that an objection, Senator? Okay, thank you. So there is an objection to the amendment to the amendment. Are there any other discussions? Senator Ada?
I just, I did have earlier conversation with the mover of the amendment, and this thing about rules have to go through the administrative adjudication process. Quite honestly, is news to me, because I've had agencies under my oversight. I've actually developed rules and regs. They sent it directly to me, and then basically the public hearing process was conducted down here because a bill was introduced to adopt the rules and regs. Public hearing was conducted down here, and if it required a subsequent roundtable discussion, then it was done. But there's a new twist that was said here tonight, was that the rules and regs were going to get sent down to the legislature, and then the governor would call us into special session without a public hearing. And so that then the bill won't get a public hearing. If that's what's going to happen, I certainly would have concerns about that, because I think it's imperative that whether the public hearing be conducted by Reventax, who's promulgating it, or it gets conducted by us, that public hearing has to take place, and get that input from the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Estevez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is probably just more of a technical comment. We're going along the lines of the amendment to the amendment and striking out "in accordance with the administrative adjudication law." But after listening to my colleagues, I think regardless, even if we put a period at the end of 180 days, then the AAA process would automatically apply. And just as with any other rules and regulations, there are still always two options. Do the executive branch. Go to your senator to put it in bill form, introduce it and have a public hearing, or go through the AAA process. I don't think they're, just as a matter of technical reference, I don't think we need to reference in accordance with the AAA process because it's already applicable outside of an introduction of the bill. So I just want to make that note, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Before you close, are there any other discussions on the amendment to the amendment? If not, Senator Castro.
Yeah, thank you. Just to clarify, no, the intent was never to, infer or imply that we would subject ourselves to a special session without a public hearing. I guess the statement, to be clear, was that in the event we didn't call ourselves into session, that tool was there only after a public hearing. And so that's in the intent, and I do stand with Senator Ada's concerns about ensuring that there's due public notice and hearing on the matter.
Thank you. On the amendment to the amendment, there is an objection, so all those in favor of the Castro amendment, please signify by raising your hands. I can't count. Motion passes. On the ADA amendment, are there any other discussions? Are there any objections to the ADA amendment? There being no objections, motion passes. We have,
Mr. Chair.
yes,
Mr. Chair, it's
Senator. 841.
I'm sorry, it's 8:41 according to we've been here for a very long period of time, and I know that we're going to be here tomorrow for a very long period of time, and possibly even the day to follow and whatnot. I move that we recess for this evening and come back tomorrow. You call the time. But I just moved to recess and perhaps come back in at, 9 or 10 tomorrow. There's a lot of information that needs to be processed. I know our clerk and our legal counsel have had a very difficult time following all amendments that have been gone through, and there's still a lot of reconciliation that needs to happen behind the scenes once we recess from this hall. And so I ask that we recess until tomorrow, and again, I'll leave it to you or anybody in the body to set the time.
Okay. Is there any, Senator Castro? Can you state, sorry? Just objection?
Yeah, I have an objection to the call for recess. Slightly different recommendation, but if it's non-debatable, I guess you're going to have to vote on it. Otherwise, I'd like to share my thoughts. So.
Okay, there is an objection to recess. There's an objection. So all those in favor of, you want to object to it because you have an amendment, or you have a?
Well, actually, I was going to suggest that we move to rise out of the committee of the whole and then come back tomorrow to vote on the measure with all the amendments intact. That way, when we come back, we can have some resolve and take action on it up or down with the amendments intact. That was my only contribution to the discussion as far as the recess is concerned.
Mr. Chair, to rise from the committee of the whole right now without allowing any more amendments would be an injustice to this bill going forward. One of the things that's missing from this bill is an amendment that I'm going to proffer, which again creates the GMH stabilization fund, which is a lockbox mechanism. And so again, if we want to continue on the night and keep working until we're crazy dead, it doesn't serve us any purpose. I think for fresher minds, I believe we need to come back tomorrow morning.
Okay, we're on recess till 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Thank you.